Is the global gap between rich and poor widening?
Well, there's no doubt that the gap between the rich and poor globally is widening, but more than that, it's widening at an alarming pace. Oxfam's done the research which shows that 80 people in the world own the equivalent wealth of another 3.5 billion who are some of the poorest people. So this is a trend that's continuing. If we allow it to continue, then that concentration of wealth will increase even further. So we have to call this out. We're in good company. It's not only Oxfam that's talking about inequality, it's the IMF, it's the President of the United States, it's the Pope, but we need action around this growing inequality gap.
What does widening global inequality mean for the poorest people?
For the poorest people in the world, if we continue to allow the gap between the richest and the poorest to widen, it means that what we do is further trap them in a cycle of poverty. We've seen, for example, that if in fact we had continued to try to lift people out of poverty in countries like Asia at an equitable rate, we would be much more successful in actually seeing that people are living in appropriate circumstances, that people aren't requiring the support that they need. But whilst we continue to concentrate wealth, whilst we continue to not tackle the real challenges around what this means, then we see people that will be entrenched in cycles of poverty. We see people that won't be able to have access to the sorts of things that much of the world actually now takes for granted, certainly the Western world. So this is a problem that can be intractable unless we pull real levers to make a difference, real global levers to actually make a difference.
How can climate change impact on inequality?
What we see with climate change is that it poses one of the biggest challenges to actually tackling global inequality and poverty. I've just come back from Vanuatu where I've looked at the impact of Cyclone Pam, which hit the islands in March of this year. And I've talked to people who are chiefs in villages who tell poignant and real stories about how much their environment has changed as a result of global warming. And a particular chief on the island of Epi who actually points to a rock which is some way out into the water and says that's where we used to actually get our water, and now that's part of the ocean. And his concern for the future of his people. This is in Vanuatu. We see the impact on 200,000 people, but it's replicated over and over again in many countries where they're experiencing extreme climatic events, where they're experiencing changes in seasons, where they can't anticipate what they need to do to actually protect their food supply, protect their water supply, and to actually deal with the issues and the problems that are generated by the rich Western countries that hand out aid on the one hand and hand out carbon emissions on the other, which impacts most adversely on poor people. So climate change, from our perspective, has to be tackled. It's a major barrier to people being able to escape poverty, to escape hunger, and to in fact be control of the environment in which they live.
Will recent decisions to reduce Australian aid affect inequality and human rights, particularly for people in the Asia-Pacific region?
What we've seen in Australia are absolutely unprecedented cuts to the overseas aid budget. What we need to keep in perspective is that the amount of money that Australia spends on overseas aid is less probably than 50 cents out of every $100 of our overall expenditure. Now, this is a small amount of money, and it's going to be less as a proportion of our gross national income into the future because of the cuts to the aid budget. Will it make a difference to human rights? Will it make a difference to people in our region? Absolutely it will. These are amounts that are spent where an Australian dollar will go a long way to make a difference to the lives of people who are living in poverty, who are living in poor circumstances in Asia and the Pacific. What we also need to bear in mind is that Australia is a wealthy country. Notwithstanding the kind of economic challenges that many Western countries are facing, we are still coming off a period of unprecedented prosperity. We're still rated very high on the Credit Suisse index of wealth. and we still rate reasonably well in terms of the generosity that Australians are willing to give out of their own pockets. But we should never underestimate the importance of overseas aid and the links that that gives us to supporting people and helping them. And the sort of cuts that we've seen, frankly, hold us in very bad stead internationally. On the one hand, we can't be calling for international diplomacy on various issues, and yet on the other hand, taking the resources away. We've seen cuts of up to 40% in many parts of Asia. We've seen enormous cuts on the African continent, where arguably some of the poorest people in the world live. We've seen some protection certainly in the Pacific region, our nearest neighbours, but there's so much more to be done, and so much more that can be done, and Australia can afford to do that.
Would a change in taxation focus from labour and consumption to capital and wealth improve inequality?
We're hearing a lot about tax reform. We're hearing about it domestically, we're hearing about it globally. Even the Business Council in Australia is actually calling on the government and the opposition to come up with a bipartisan position in relation to tax reform. This is such a critical issue. If we don't actually get an understanding of how taxation systems can make a difference to lifting people out of poverty, then we're really missing a really important part of the equation. So consumption taxes are regressive. Obviously they impact on some of the poorest people in the world. They don't actually tackle the concentration of wealth that we're seeing increasingly. They don't actually tackle the issue of how we have social protections that should be in place in many of these countries. Oxfam generally is speaking about progressive taxes, taxes that actually focus on looking at not how it impacts on consumption, how it impacts on poor people, but how it actually looks at what the interests of communities are overall. We need to have a much more sophisticated debate about taxation globally. We need to actually have some of the countries that are committed to tackling tax reform rise to the occasion, and we certainly need to look at what's happening with much of revenue that's taken out of some of the poorest countries in the world by multinational countries, so that it can actually be put to good use instead of lining the pockets of people who already have a lot of money themselves.
How significant an impact does corporate tax avoidance have on inequality?
Oxfam did a lot of work before the G20 that was held in Brisbane last year, with a big ask around global tax reform, and in particular our ask was to look at multinational corporations and what's lost through the lack of transparency around what taxation is paid, what money is actually shunted offshore, and what an impact it has on some of the countries where resources in particular are being taken from those countries. There are billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars annually that's actually lost through taxation fraud. Some of the figures are the equivalent to what the GDP is of major countries like the United States. This has to be something where there is a common interest in actually tackling this, but it has to be global. We've already seen some moves in actual transparency around declarations about what happens with tax. But while we have tax havens, while we have countries that are shifting profits, while we have the lack of transparency about what is actually being paid in some of the poorest countries in the world, where we see that there is a lack of infrastructure and yet enormous concessions given to multinational companies, this is a major challenge for us. We need a firmer resolve. We need to be able to hold multinational companies to account. At the end of the day, the investment that's made in the social protections for some of the world's poorest people is going to be a much more important dividend than some of the dividends that are paid to shareholders of these multinational companies.